Good afternoon, Chair Davis, Vice Chair Duncan, Superintendent Truitt, Lieutenant Governor Robinson, board members and advisors, my colleagues at the board and with the department, and all those across the great Shire of public education in North Carolina. I would like to take a moment to share a quick reflection on recent events impacting our country and our students. As many of you undoubtedly struggled with sleep last night, given the siege on our nation's capital, I wrestled with the ever-conscious mindset of an educator and how we would teach these events to our children. And while I've been out of the classroom for almost 3 years, the perspective never leaves those who have graced the halls of a school. It is an awareness of a former social studies teacher that the lens matters, the words are significant, the definitions are critical, and the allowance of the time for students to work through very challenging life events with a guide, a mentor, or a teacher is the process by which all of us gain understanding, we develop empathy, and we actualize the depths of our social being, our humanity, and the foundation of a thriving democracy. I had a picture of my students from a 2013 Dustin Greenhouse program in South Africa for a global education and cultural immersion experience of a lifetime. We had a layover in Washington, D.C. and decided to visit the International Holocaust Museum and the nation's capital. And as we walked through the People's House, we marveled at the history and the pride that was reflected in the physical artifacts, the paintings, the statues, and the documents. And I remember pausing in the National Sanctuary Hall and participating in the John Quincy Adams story of the whispering. My students walked to the other side of the hall and whispered, "Mr. Freebird's hair looks like a hobbit," and other jovial teasings. I heard it clear that day, and we talked how this acoustic anomaly was rumored to give an advantage in understanding and opposing conversation or strategy. But rather than focus on the divisive nature of the room's history, we turn to remember just how inspiring the undertakings of our nation's leaders were and just how sacred the floors we stood on represented. We discussed its long-standing history and then its neighboring rooms and the movements, decisions, changes, and transformations that resonated in the voices of the past. Like the events of the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the 19th Amendment, the end of World War I and World War II, the Civil Rights Act, the end of the Cold War, and the decisions made following 9/11. It has held the State of the Union addresses of our presidents and has held U.S. citizens who have lain in state or honor following their passing. American heroes like John Lewis and George H.W. Bush, John McCain, Elijah Cummings, Rosa Parks, Reverend Billy Graham, and recently Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The chamber represents the foundation of our country's law, of our country's constitutional duty, law and order, the protection of our rights, and the defense of our freedom. And this is how I'll remember this experience. But this is not how I will remember this day. For yesterday questioned whether that law and order is guaranteed, whether our rights have been protected, and whether freedom has been defended. The constitutional duty reminded me of our constitutional commitment in North Carolina Public Schools, and your decisions today and moving forward, guided by the collective leadership of this State Board of Education and DPI's leadership led by Superintendent Truitt and her staff, have the opportunity to keep students at the center of understanding. At everything. Each and every one, as we transcend the impact of COVID-19 on yesterday's events and focus on transition and recovery strategies for our schools, our families, and our communities. One team, one vision, moving forward. So again, I want to focus on the whole child public school student support, our diagram that we use as our guiding principles here based on the strategic plan. And then also to remind us of our mission and of our goals. And that leads us to the status of the CARES Act funding that Vice Chair Duncan so eloquently discussed a few minutes ago. I do believe he did a great job of covering each one of these individually, and just would move to the next slide where we look at the new supplemental ESSER 2 funding. At this time, we're estimating this to be around $1.6 billion. And then, as you can see here, the expiration September 30th of 2023. Similar distribution to Formula ESSER 1. And at this time, there's been no timeline for distribution, although the State Board of Education, again, in a conversation with DPI, may set aside up to 10%, which is approximately 163 for state level initiatives and administration. So as Vice Chair Duncan remarked earlier, this is definitely something that to keep in the back of our minds as we're looking at legislative priorities and budget requests, that there is the possibility that some of our initiatives and priorities may be addressed with that funding. So over the last 3 months of this process, we have taken the strategic plan of the State Board of Education and broken it down into COVID-19 transition and recovery strategies. The 4 main recovery strategies reflected in the conversations at the board and those across the state in advocacy efforts reflect addressing statewide learning challenges and recovery, whole child, whole school, whole community, education workforce development, both in a teacher and principal recruitment and retention, and connecting middle and high school students in post-secondary and career opportunities. There's also been risen support for other agency priorities, whether these include support for teacher and principal recruitment, retention, and compensation strategies, or in school business system modernization, along with other department priorities. So I want to begin just with a brief rundown of where we have arrived in several of the main priorities and strategies that reflect each one of those previous 4 kind of umbrella underneath the COVID transition and recovery. The first is the school and district assistance and turnaround. So this is rebuilding NCDPI district and regional support staff capacity. And this strategy reiterates several supportive comments made during yesterday's presentation and really reflects the strategy and resources needed for services and increased follow-up that will sustain the collective effort of moving all designated low-performing schools to consistently high-performing. Dr. Cynthia Martin and her team have done a great job in outlining their efforts, and also Dr. Bev Emery in her new role and the support there. So this has definitely been a priority that has been lifted up and will continue the efforts of the CARES 10% funding, the $4.5 million that was provided in that. The next reiterates what was just discussed in the broadband internet connectivity. The next actually addresses statewide learning challenges with the plan to address early grades learning challenges through a statewide system of training on the science of reading. So as we continue to lift up this priority, working through strategies to do that. As earlier referenced by Carl Logan's presentation on the driver education strategic plan, there are significant modifications in response to COVID, but also a 2021-2023 support in the curriculum and technology fund, and also in regional support. You all will be voting on a proposal that will also speak to this work and how this will ultimately be funded. Next, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead on this one, sorry. The next will be to continue support for broadband internet connectivity. And I really appreciate the comments by both Lieutenant Governor Robinson and Vice Chair Duncan in the move of this by our state as a commitment to turning this into a utility instead of a luxury. And we are really excited to hear of the efforts of the CARES 10% funding to look at different connectivity exploration, including low orbit satellite and also the SpaceX initiative. So synthesizing these efforts and this exploration of what is going on at the state level really looks at a commitment to broadband connectivity for our students and continued support there. I wanted to just give a brief rundown of some other considerations that have been raised over the last few months in addressing statewide learning challenges. And I hope you see the nuance there and the change of language. As in the original statement, words really do matter. And as we're looking at, rather than statewide learning loss, this redefining of this idea of what are the challenges and how can we create solutions to face those challenges. I think this is an important message for us to continue to lift up. Some of these considerations include how do we evaluate reading and math levels, state-supported summer learning programs, school accountability and teacher effectiveness models, which were being considered prior to COVID by the board. How do we look at graduation, end-of-year grades, testing and accountability, and then also further programs to support dropout prevention and grade promotion, and then ultimately returning to the ADM projections and looking at that for the 2021-22 school year. The next bucket reflects the whole child, whole school, whole community. The whole child team has presented several times on the student mental health policy plan, which was put into place by Senate Bill 476. So this priority would help to fund this plan. Also continuing to lift up the need for student support services staffing, and also pilot development for pipeline development of some of these professions, particularly the discipline of school psychologists. Continuing to support exceptional children funding for future services, and also the board and department's commitment to whole child through child nutrition. Continuing in this bucket is looking at the increased number of our students that are limited English proficiency and English as a second language, and expanding this funding. Looking at social and emotional learning pilots for pre-K and kindergartners, and addressing the large influx of potential kindergartners that may be returning next year to our in-person classrooms. Residential school staff and contractual services, and also standing up of the Office of Equity Affairs here at the department. The third bucket is education workforce development. These are several initiatives and programs that have been brought up by the board and the department to consider for priorities moving forward. We just had a presentation on the advanced teaching roles, the new teacher support program, Teach NC and Jobs Board, which was presented, I believe, last February, Teaching Fellows Program, different district models for alternative principal recruitment, turnaround principal training programs, North Carolina virtual observation tools, and also updates on educator licensure system. And the last bucket to consider is connecting middle and high school students and post-secondary and career opportunities. This has been a priority of the board, including the continued support of the cooperative innovative high schools, looking at certifications and credentials and certifications for our CTE students, the CTE credential and performance-based data collection and assessment model, and then also looking at the CCRG and career readiness assessment. We did, as mentioned earlier, there are other priorities not underneath those four buckets particularly that we do want to lift up, and that is continuing work in lifting up compensation strategies for teachers and principal recruitment. Also not on here, but as mentioned earlier, supporting the Drive Task Force by Dr. Jackson, expansion of CTE, teaching profession courses in that pipeline development piece, and then standing up and supporting different district models of alternative teacher recruitment models. So this could be the 2+2 as referenced earlier, the TA to teachers, troops to teachers. Some of these have great success around our state, so how can we support those, whether through communication or resources? The final slide supports another one of the department agency requests, which is school business systems modernization. The new leadership team is meeting with this team and looking at exactly what these priorities and strategies will be moving forward and how to support school business systems modernization, as well as what was just referenced in cybersecurity expansion by Michael Ramsey and his team, and the E-rate program, UERS stabilization fund, and student information system update. I did want to remind that the last presentation did have other department requests on there, and as Vice Chair Duncan mentioned earlier, in order to allow Superintendent Truitt and her leadership team the time to look over those requests, we have kept those off of this presentation in hopes that her team will have the next 3 weeks to really look through, to prepare, and then to present to the board in February. My new colleague and I, Jamie Falkenberry, who he and I will be working through the Office of Government and Community Affairs for both DPI and the State Board of Education. So definitely want to extend a great welcoming hand to him and really look forward to our collective work together as we present to you all in February on the hopefully final priorities and strategies and budget requests going over to the General Assembly. Are there any questions?